This is the New Way Young Adult Podcast. New Way is the young adult ministry of Franklin Heights Church. This podcast is a sermon from our Wednesday night gathering, and we pray that God would use it in your life as you navigate these young adult years.
We begin a brand new series titled, This Wasn't the Plan. And I'm grateful for the chance to get to start this series out, to kick it off. And then over the next several weeks, the next few Wednesdays, Pastor Taylor will be here. He will continue it and then wrap it up in just a few weeks. But we are going through the book and the life of Ruth that we find in the Old Testament. And the reason that we chose to title This Wasn't the Plan, and the purpose of this whole series is because in young adult life, the season we find ourselves in, it's a season where everything truly is shifting. There's not a lot of constants. Everyone's throwing at you their version, whether it's at work, at school, at church, of what they believe the truth is, and there's pressure to define what your life is going to be very, very quickly. It feels like you got to have it done by 20, 21, 22. And in our young adult years, nothing really feels fully stable. Maybe you're in this room and you had your college plan figured out, but now you're finding you're at the end of year one and you're finding out you have zero interest in the major that you picked and you've already paid for tuition. There's no getting that back. Or maybe you already have a clear career direction and you're settled in that, but you're trying to get that first job out of college, and every single job interview you get out of makes you feel like you've probably spent the last 4 years of your life and tuition for absolutely nothing, and it feels like a waste because you feel like you're not going anywhere. Maybe it's on the relationship side, and you felt like there was a relationship you were in that was going to go the distance, and you felt like you were going to get married, and you were going to spend your life with this person, but then you find that your time and your priorities have you kind of reckoning with the fact that maybe this isn't going to be for life, and you're trying to figure out and pick up the pieces of what's broken apart. Maybe you've figured all those questions out. You went through college or you went into the workforce and you figured out your career and you feel settled in that. Maybe even you're married or you feel settled in that. You're about to get married, but you assumed at this point, because you have all those things together, things would be a little more settled than they are by now. And that leads us all to the book of Ruth, where we're going to be studying over these next 4 weeks. Most of the time, if you've grown up in church or if you've heard anything about the book of Ruth, most of the time, the takeaways, the principles, the things we learn are the relationship that comes at the end of the book between Ruth and a guy named Boaz. They get together, they get married, they live happily ever after, all of those things. And if you've been in church long enough, you've probably heard that if you're a lady in the room, you got to find the Boaz in your life. And that's the person that you need to find. Don't waste your time on anybody else. Find a Boaz. Don't find anybody else. And if you're a guy in the room, you got to be looking for that Proverbs 31 type of Ruth woman. That's who you need to look for. Don't waste your time on anybody else. That's what we're looking for. But honestly, in this series, and honestly, while there's some relational takeaways we can have from this book, and we might even touch on those in the next coming weeks from this series, we actually see that there's an entirely different main point of this book. We see that the main point of this book actually shows and reveals God quietly, consistently working behind the scenes to redeem brokenness and accomplish his purposes when two ladies, a lady named Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, find themselves in a situation where they're saying, this wasn't the plan. And so that leads us to Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. If you've got your Bibles here, I encourage you to turn to there. If not, we're going to have it on the screen behind here. But Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, this is what it says. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So just to paint a little bit of the picture here, you've got a wife named Naomi, you got her husband who's got a hard name, and you got 2 sons that also have really hard names I'm going to have to pronounce in a second. And they find themselves, they're Israelites living in Bethlehem, and they live during the time of the judges. And then on top of this, there's a famine in the land that they have no other recourse, no other choice than to move and pack up everything they have and move to a completely foreign land, this land of Moab. And again, this uprooted everything that they had. And on top of that, again, like it says in the first phrase of this verse, this was the time of the judges in Israel, and this was the time of famine in the land. Last year, if you remember this, we went through a study in the book of Judges. We talked about that cycle of it was the Israelites' obedience, and then they turned away, and then they got in trouble, and then they came back to the Lord. And it was just that cycle over and over. It wasn't just a little bit of instability in this time. There was moral confusion. There was spiritual drift, national uncertainty, and cycles of crisis. It was a time where nothing felt secure. And then on top of that, like we said, there's a famine where the culture's in confusion, the economy's unstable, and for this family, Naomi and her husband and her 2 sons, their future is completely up in the air at this point. And young adult life, honestly, can sometimes feel like its own version of the time of the judges. And the reason I say that, I don't know if as I read this first verse and kind of gave a little bit of the backstory, a lot of that feels like living in America right now, to be honest with you. You got global wars that we hear every single day about that we don't know if they're going to end or when they're going to end or what'll be next. You go on Facebook and your grandma is posting about stuff where every news post, somebody in the comments goes, this is AI, this is a deep fake, this is fake, and you're not sure. You don't even know, and you're 25, and you're like, I don't know. Or the cost of living. You're just trying to pay your rent. You're just trying to deal with the fact that utilities are like double what they used to be, and every time you go to the pump, you're not sure how much more it's going to be than the last time you filled up 4 days ago, and it could be double that. And it feels like being a sojourner in the land where maybe earlier generations, your parents, your grandparents, had time to figure things out. They had time to figure out their career. They had time to figure out their relationships and get their feet settled. But we're left, feels like, to figure out our futures in an unstable world. And when we feel this way, we find out this truth that'll be behind me here. Moments of uncertainty are often the moments where our plans feel most fragile. And that is a hard thing sometimes to reckon with, to deal with. And so we see for this family of Naomi and her husband and her sons, things go from bad to worse. On top of all of these things, her husband, it says in verse 3, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, he died. And she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 men took Moabite wives where they were now living. The name of one was Orpah. I promised I wouldn't say Oprah. And the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And then both these 2 sons, Mahon and Chilion, they died as well. So that the woman, Naomi, was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so now you've got this woman who has taken up everything from her homeland. She has moved across an entire river, moved to a foreign land, now has lost every single member of her family and is left with the 2 daughters-in-law that she had with her sons. And they're in shock, these 3 ladies. And for Naomi, the plan was just originally to survive, but then a famine hit. The plan was a family, but unexpected loss happened. And the plan was a future, but everything, time after time, seemed to just collapse around them. And so we see as these verses go on that Naomi honestly begins to look like she's frantically planning for something else. She's trying to grasp at anything she can. And we see that starting in verse 8. It says this, but Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. But they replied to her and said to her, no, we will return with you to your people, the Israelites. But she said, no, my daughters, it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Which leads us to our first point of the night, which is this. When plans collapse, choose to not walk through it alone. When plans collapse, we've got to choose to not walk through it alone. And while maybe nobody in this room right here and right now has experienced loss at a level like Naomi has in this first chapter, there are moments that we face that can lead us to the same mindset that we see Naomi have. I'm going to give a few examples. Imagine if you're a little bit older than now high school, you're in your 20s. Imagine yourself at a fresh 18 years old. You're out of high school. You're excited. You've packed up for college. You've said your goodbyes to your parents. Your mama's kissed you on the cheek, and you head out. You head out for college. You're excited. You have the plan in place. You chose your major. You even secured the scholarships. And then over the years, you invest the time, and you got the degree. But then you come back after that time to your hometown, and all that excitement that you left with pretty much feels like it's turned into an outrageous monthly payment for your college tuition that you're paying back now from college debt. And you got pressure from your parents and your family of when you're going to find a job that's in your field and when you're going to actually make a career for yourself, and you feel that pressure. Or maybe you're at college right now and you're in the midst of that, and you have found yourself around the most people you ever have in your life, and at the same time you feel more alone than you ever have. Maybe you're in college, or you were, and you had a great social life and you had that purpose, but now you've returned home and life just feels boring. You don't know where to turn. You don't have a social life. You don't have the friends that you once did because they went their separate ways too. Or finally, maybe you didn't take any of those routes. You went straight to the workforce. You said, I'm not getting into debt. I'm not doing that. People got $50,000 in debt. I'm not doing it. But you stayed in your hometown. Maybe you went away to another place. And even though it started out great, maybe you find yourself in a place where you're like, I feel stuck. There's not really a career ladder for me here. I don't know really where to turn. And your hometown, or the place where you felt secure in, has started to feel more like a trap of quicksand that you can't escape. And when what you expected has now not become the reality, when it's something totally different, we can begin to react in the two ways that Naomi did, and these are important: isolation and bitterness. And we find this in verses 20 and 21. This is how she reacts to the moment. This is later on in the chapter. Naomi said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full. I had my family. I had a plan. I had everything I needed, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So we see these two things, and we'll see it on the screen right here. She has isolation. She has tried to separate herself. She's told her two daughters-in-law, no, go back. You've got a hope. You've got a future. You've got something to look forward to, but I'm going to try to protect myself by pulling away. But in reality, isolation only cuts you off from the support God's trying to give you. It distorts your thinking, because when you're alone and you isolate, you only have yourself to let those thoughts mull over and over, and it intensifies the pain instead of doing the hard work to heal it. And then bitterness, which might even be more dangerous, it doesn't just sit quietly in your heart. It begins to be the narrator in your life. It subtly undermines your trust in God's character. It tells you that in every situation, you'll be the only one that's overlooked. It tells you, you know what, you can't really trust anybody anymore because they did you wrong that first time. And probably most importantly, it begins to rewrite your identity and interpret your life through the lens of pain, not of who you are in your relationship with Christ. But there's an antidote to these two things, and this is even more important. You have isolation and bitterness, but we see in a moment that Naomi and Ruth, even through that pain, choose a different path, which is one of faithfulness and connection. And this is important too. This will be on the screen. Faithfulness says, I will not allow pain to rewrite the narrative of my life that God has promised to redeem for His glory. That is an important thing that faithfulness does when we follow in that. And then connection, instead of isolation, it reminds us, and this is key, that it is better to be known than to fake being fine. And I want to say that again. It is better to be known than to fake being fine. And you'll notice in the terms that Naomi and Ruth say back and forth to each other, they are very transparent. They make it very clear that they are not fine. And they are in a terrible situation. And so Naomi doesn't sugarcoat her feelings. She says, the Lord has been very bitter towards me. And then later on, we see that Ruth also doesn't give Naomi any sort of false hope either. She just kind of says it the way that it is. And this is a really important point that we find from it. Transparency. It leads to embracing reality, which we have to do when our plans collapse and everything is turned upside down. And it also allows others to be into our story and to speak into our lives and to give us wisdom. So the question we have to face right now, is there a relationship in your life, whether it be with a significant other, whether it be with a family member, where a lack of transparency has caused confusion? It's caused some awkward, tense moments where it would be much better to just deal with it in the moment, realizing that it's better to be known and understood and transparent than to ever try to be fine with faking it. And that's where we find ourselves in the story of Naomi and Ruth here. And then in verse 14, kind of the central part of this whole first chapter, we see what Ruth's response is. So a little bit of context starting in verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. This is the three ladies there, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, and they're crying together. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, meaning she left. But Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Why don't you return after your sister-in-law? But this is the key, verse 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Which leads us to point number 2, if you're writing these down tonight. When plans collapse, it reveals where your life is anchored. When plans collapse, it reveals where your life is already anchored. And we see that in the moment where there's really a fork in the road. These two daughters-in-law, they both got a choice. They've been told that they can go back. And again, in this culture, to think about it, there's a tense moment here, because for these ladies in this culture, to be a widow meant that your entire future was insecure. A lot of times marriage meant that there was security for both for finances and passing on your family name and all of these things. There was not a lot of opportunities for ladies, unfortunately, to be able to move on if they weren't in a marriage. And so Naomi's urging him, hey, while you're young, go, make a future for yourself. And so they're faced with the decision. Orpah chooses to go back to what she knew, to the land of Moab, to her family, I'm sure to her hometown where she knew everything. It was familiar. But then Ruth has this pivotal moment that we just read about where she decides to stay. And there was so much at risk and at stake with this. I really, it's even hard to paint the picture of how pivotal this is. It really is like out of a movie. Ruth is walking away from her homeland, her culture, every bit of security that she had in her family, her future options, her identity as she knew it. And she chooses instead a bunch of things that are unknown. A widow, not to mention her ex-mother-in-law in a foreign land, a future she can't control, and a God that she is still learning to trust. And that helps us to know this, and it'll also be on the screen. When everything familiar is stripped away, what you're anchored to is finally revealed. That is a guarantee. When everything that is familiar in our lives that we've been clinging to is stripped away, it really will reveal what you have been anchored to the whole time. And as young adults, there are so many things that compete for what I would call the anchor of our peace, where we truly anchor our lives. We say things like, okay, once I get this job, I really will be secure. I won't have a lot of worries. Once I make this dollar figure, I don't have to worry about financial security. Or even if your plans collapse, maybe you say to yourself, okay, as long as I get up, make a new plan for myself, be independent like I'm called to do, then I won't fall behind like everybody else. Everybody else is a little bit further ahead, but I can catch up if I just work harder. And I think a great example of this, and speaking about anchoring, is, especially in this area, I bet you most of the people in this room have been out on some sort of boat, whether it's a tiny one on the lake, whether you've been on a cruise ship, either one, somewhere in between, you'll notice that in pretty much every situation, in certain kind of environments, you've got to anchor that boat a lot further from shore than what it looks like to your eyes. A lot of times when you get close to the shore, they have to put the anchor down and you got to put a life jacket on and get in a smaller boat and go, or you got to swim to the shore because you have no idea what's under the surface. Even from our perspective, as someone who doesn't do anything like boating, I wouldn't be able to see what's underneath the surface. But just like people who are navigators know, sometimes God anchors you in a situation that you wouldn't have asked for. But it's to prepare you for something greater that we truly can't know. And this is important. In this moment, we see in this passage, Ruth, this is really important to take away for us too. Ruth's circumstances when she makes this declaration of, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. She is making a paradigm shift where she is turning away, going a completely opposite direction. The thing to note is, after this is done, this epic speech, nothing's changed. There's been nothing about her life that has changed at this point. They're still destitute. She's going to a foreign land. She doesn't know a single person other than her mother-in-law. But you notice that something within inside of her stabilizes in this moment after she makes this declaration. And we can take something away from this. When our plans collapse, nothing has to change on the outside for us to be able to find internal peace that comes from being anchored in God. And so then we jump down to verse 22, wrapping up the chapter, coming to the end of this moment, and it says this: so Naomi returned, and Ruth, the Moabite, they make point that she is a foreigner, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Jerusalem at the beginning of barley harvest, which leads us to our last point for the night. When plans collapse, determine that your character will remain constant. When everything collapses around, determine that your character will remain constant. Again, one more time, because it's so hard in our culture and through this lens to see the impact of this moment. You have got two ladies who have now brought everything that they had, brought it up, packed up shop. They're moving back to this land where Naomi grew up in. And she's saying Naomi left with a full family. She left, her friends, her family, everybody around her saw this happen. They packed up 10 years ago. And when they come back, there's nobody with her but her daughter-in-law. And for this group of people that were in Bethlehem, this would have spoken volumes to see the fact that her daughter-in-law, who had no obligation to care for her, has chosen to return, leaving everything, leaving her family, and leaving everything that could have been part of her future. And I'm sure it made stirs around the town of Bethlehem. And it also, we see later in this book, it spoke volumes to the man who would later become Ruth's husband, Boaz. And we see this, we're going to jump ahead just for a moment to chapter 3, verse 11. Boaz says this to Ruth, and this is so key. He says, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. Because," and here's key, here's the takeaway from this, "all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." And the amazing thing, in their first interaction together, Boaz knew Ruth's character before he knew anything else about this woman. Apparently, the talk of the town was so much about, hey, did you hear that for Naomi, her daughter-in-law came back even after everybody died? She had no reason to be here. Are you kidding me? What does that mean? Why would she do that? And so talk had gotten around town about this. And Boaz saw and noticed, and God used it. And so that kind of leads us to, I think, a self-reflective question for all of us tonight, and it'll also be on the screen. Who were you before your plans collapsed? Who were the type of person you were? What was your character before plans collapsed around you? When your plans folded in, if your character was tied to anything else, anchored to anything else other than your relationship with Christ, then it is true every single time that our character, who we are as a person, is going to collapse in the process just as quickly. But if your character is tied to the hope that's in Christ, then your character is going to remain constant, even when everything else collapses around, and it secures us when there is nowhere to turn. And so we get to see a piece of this hope. This is so cool. We get to, and I'm going to jump, and Taylor will be talking about this in later weeks, but I'm going to jump ahead because I got his permission to talk about the end of the book. So jump into chapter 4, and with that, we get to see a piece of the hope found in Jesus play out in real time at the end of this book. And if you're going to flip over there, it's chapter 4, verse 13, and then the last 2 verses, and we see this. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and she bore a son. And then there's a bit of a lineage here. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And that feels just like a normal lineage of a family. That's just generation after generation. But the David that is listed here, as many of you might know, would later on be King David. That's who he would become. And then as you learn more about King David, it is directly through the line of David that God promised that the coming Messiah would be born. And so Jesus comes directly through this line. And the amazing part about this is that God, even though it might feel silent, even though it might feel behind the scenes, is orchestrating, using the pain and the brokenness, not only for his glory, but for the good of a foreigner, of Ruth, who wasn't even a child of the promise of Abraham as part of the Israelite nation. But God goes so far, and we find in the lineage of Jesus, that he includes her. He includes her in this line as a vital piece in the line towards the Messiah. And we get to see now on the other side how God wove this all together. Seeing that for her plans, they changed. There didn't seem to be a future. It took some pivotal conversations, drawing a line in the sand to say, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. I'm dropping everything behind, and I'm going towards this one thing that I don't know, but I'm going to follow because I know it to be true. And sometimes that's what we're faced with as young adults. The question really is not if our plans will change. It's truly when they're going to change, and being ready and willing to trust God in the process. And we have an opportunity to anchor ourselves to the only hope that can secure us when everything else is falling around. And so, the amazing part of that is the same person who falls at the end of that lineage, Jesus Christ, is also the one who went to such great lengths to prove his love, the sacrifice, also the power over every circumstance that he has, not only in this situation with Naomi and Ruth, but over every circumstance of every single person in this room right now. And so, in this moment, the question to ask ourselves, every single person here, is the first question is that same Jesus the one that is controlling every situation? Truly, if you're honest with yourself tonight, is he the anchor? Is he the only one in your life that can truly bear the weight of every single decision, every single moment when your plans have collapsed? And for those of us in the room that maybe we've made that decision, Jesus is front and center, we want to trust him. The question is, and we've gotten to see this on display, are you trusting him with the next step in your relationship with him? Are you taking that step in baptism and going forth in public and saying, my anchor is in the only one who can bear the weight of when everything else falls around me? I'm trusting him, and I want the world to know. Is it through something like serving? Is it a way of showing your dependence on him? Because when our plans collapse, it truly reveals where our anchor is. And so where is your anchor tonight?